the swelling river. The sky, a canvas of bruised purples and charcoal grays, pressed down on Dusty Jim's shack like a suffocating blanket. He stood in the doorway, a gnarled hand shielding his eyes, though there was precious little sun to block out. The air hung thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and an electric promise of rain. His gaze, accustomed to the wide, flat expanse of the prairie and the predictable flow of the river, narrowed. The silver stream, usually a placid ribbon of mercury, now churned with an unsettling vigor, its surface pockmarked by the first fat drops of the coming storm. "Damnation!" he grumbled, the sound a rusty rasp in his throat. He'd seen enough seasons to know this kind of sky wasn't just a passing shower. This was a proper gully washer brewing, the kind that turned trickles into torrents and the silver stream into a raging beast. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty ground, a dark, fleeting stain quickly absorbed by the parched earth. His shack, a ramshackle collection of salvaged planks and corrugated tin, offered little comfort against such a tempest. Inside, the single room was sparsely furnished, a cot piled high with threadbare blankets, a rough-hewn table, and a solitary chair. A smoky lantern, its wick barely lit, cast flickering shadows that danced like restless spirits. He'd lived here for 20 years, ferrying goods and souls across the river, a solitary sentinel in a world that largely left him alone. And that was just how he liked it. People were mostly trouble, and the river, while demanding, was at least predictable. Until now. He walked to the river's edge, his boots sinking slightly into the softening mud. The current tugged at the mooring ropes of his flat-bottomed ferry, straining against the thick knots. Debris, mostly branches and clumps of weeds, swirled past, picking up speed. The water level had already risen a good foot since morning, creeping up the bank, licking at the dry grass. He imagined the upstream tributaries, swollen with days of rain he hadn't felt here, funneling their fury into his patch of the silver stream. His ferry was sturdy, built to withstand a good many challenges, but a full-blown flood was a different beast altogether. He'd seen the river claim more than one boat, more than one man, in his time. A gust of wind, cold and sharp, whipped through the air, rustling the sparse leaves on the cottonwoods that lined the bank. Jim shivered, though not from the chill. It was the foreboding in the air, the sense of an inevitable change. He was a creature of routine, of solitude, and this storm threatened to upend it all. He considered pulling the ferry further up the bank, securing it against the rising waters, but the task would be monumental, and the rain hadn't truly started yet. Besides, what if someone needed to cross? Unlikely, with a storm brewing, but not impossible. His livelihood, however meager, depended on the river and those who sought passage. He turned back towards his shack, the wind now a constant moan. He'd need to batten down the hatches, secure anything that might blow away. His gaze swept over the desolate landscape, the endless prairie stretching to the horizon, now a monochrome canvas under the darkening sky. He was alone out here, miles from the nearest town, and the thought, usually a comfort, now felt like a heavy burden. Then, a new sound, cutting through the rising howl of the wind and the distant rumble of thunder, a rhythmic thudding, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, hoofbeats, fast ones. Coming from the east, along the winding track that led to the ferry. Jim paused, his hand already reaching for the latch on his shack door. Who in the blazes would be riding in this weather? And with such urgency, the sound grew, a frantic drumming against the gathering storm, signaling an unexpected and likely unwelcome arrival. A strange request. The rain, a relentless drumming on the corrugated tin roof of his shack, had finally convinced Dusty Jim that the river was impassable. He'd just settled down by the sputtering fire, a mug of stale coffee warming his calloused hands, when a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision snagged his attention. Through the rain-streaked window, a silhouette emerged from the swirling gray, leading a pack mule, and on the mule's back, unmistakable even in the gloom, was a coffin. Jim grunted, pushing himself from the rickety chair. Another fool, probably lost, thinking he could brave the rapids. He yanked open the door, letting a gust of cold, damp air swirl into the meager warmth. The figure leading the mule was tall and gaunt, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring most of his face, rain-plastered strands of dark hair to his temples. He stopped a respectful distance from the porch, the mule snorting softly, its breath misting in the frigid air. "Evening," Jim rasped, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over the river's roar. "River's closed. Come back in the morning, if there's a morning to be had." The man didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the churning water. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, barely audible over the storm. "I need to cross, now," Jim snorted, a plume of smoke escaping his nostrils. "Need don't make the river safe, mister. Look at it. She's a beast tonight. No boat's getting through." He gestured to the river, a dark, roiling mass that had swallowed its banks, tossing debris like matchsticks. "I understand the risk," the man said, his voice gaining a desperate edge, "but I can't wait. It's urgent." He finally lifted his head, and Jim saw the dark circles under his eyes, the tight line of his jaw. This wasn't just a traveler. This was a man hunted or haunted. "Urgent ain't gonna stop you from drowning," Jim retorted, a familiar irritation bubbling up. He'd seen too many desperate fools meet the river's unforgiving embrace. The man took a hesitant step forward, his hand moving to a leather pouch hanging at his belt. "I'll pay, whatever it takes." He untied the pouch, the soft clink of metal against leather cutting through the pelting rain. He poured a stream of gold coins onto the palm of his hand, a dazzling cascade of wealth that even Jim, with his disdain for frivolous spending, couldn't ignore. "This," the man said, his voice a low, urgent plea, "and more. Just get us across." He gestured to the coffin, a stark black rectangle against the mule's flank. "Please, there isn't much time." Jim's eyes widened slightly, the glint of gold momentarily eclipsing the grim reality of the raging river. He'd never seen so much coin offered for a simple ferry ride, not even from the wealthiest prospectors. The man's desperation was palpable, a heavy cloak he wore as surely as the rain-soaked clothes. A strange, uncomfortable prickle stirred in Jim's chest, a feeling he usually squashed with a cynical remark. But the sheer volume of gold, coupled with the man's raw, undeniable urgency, gnawed at him. This wasn't just about a body in a box. It was about something deeper, something that echoed the storm's own furious demands. Into the torrent. The rope creaked, a mournful sound swallowed by the rising wind. Jim, his face, a granite mask under the brim of his oilcloth hat, raced himself against the ferry's stern. The river, a churning beast of gray and brown, already frothed at its banks, carrying debris, splintered branches, a bloated animal carcass, in its angry current. "Hold tight, boy," he grunted, the words ripped from his lips by a sudden gust. He didn't wait for a reply, didn't look at Silas. With a powerful shove of his shoulder, he pushed the ferry's broad nose into the roiling water. The current seized the flatboat instantly, yanking it downstream with alarming force. Jim wrestled with the tiller, his muscles straining against the river's relentless pull. Rain, fine at first, then thickening into a stinging deluge, began to lash down, obscuring the opposite bank until it was just a hazy smear of dark green. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening explosion that vibrated through the very planks beneath their feet. Silas, huddled near the draped coffin, flinched with every lightning flash that briefly illuminated the terrifying scene. He clutched the rough wood of the ferry's railing, his knuckles white. The coffin, secured with ropes Jim had expertly cinched, groaned and shifted with the ferry's violent pitching. A particularly strong wave slammed into the side, sending spray high into the air and rocking the entire vessel violently. Silas gasped, his eyes wide with a fear that tasted of river water and desperation. He imagined the coffin breaking free, tumbling into the hungry current, its contents lost forever. "She's a bucking bronco, ain't she?" Jim yelled over the storm's roar, a grim satisfaction in his voice. He wrestled the tiller harder, guiding the ferry with a practiced hand that belied his gruff exterior. A fallen tree trunk, thick as a man's waist, surged past them, narrowly missing the bow. Jim swore, a short, sharp oath swallowed by the wind. Silas watched the coffin, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tarpaulin, previously taut, now billowed and snapped like a sail, threatening to tear loose. He instinctively reached out, pressing a hand against the cold, damp canvas. The ferry dipped again, a sickening lurch that sent a fresh wave of water sloshing across the deck. The coffin slid a few inches, groaning ominously against its bindings. Jim glanced over his shoulder, his eyes, narrowed against the rain, meeting Silas's. There was no pity there, only a hard assessment. "Hold her steady, boy," he commanded, his voice surprisingly clear above the din. "Or we all go for a swim." Silas nodded, though his throat was dry and he could barely swallow. He pressed harder against the coffin, lending what little weight he had, bracing himself against the relentless fury of the storm and the river's terrifying embrace. The journey had just begun, the unexpected cry. The sky ripped open with a blinding flash, followed by a thunderclap that vibrated through the very planks of the ferry. Rain, which had been a steady downpour, now slammed against the deck like 1,000 angry fists, instantly obliterating the already murky horizon. Dusty Jim, his oilskin slicker gleaming under sporadic lightning, tightened his grip on the rudder. The river, a raging brown beast, bucked and roared around them, tossing the small vessel like a forgotten toy. "Hold on, Silas!" Jim's shout was swallowed by the storm, but Silas, hunched protectively over the coffin, understood the urgency in the ferryman's wide eyes. He wrapped his arms tighter around the slick wood, his knuckles white against the dark grain. Guilt gnawed at him, a cold, sharp tooth. This entire perilous journey, this madness, was his doing. He'd pressed Jim, threatened him even, to take to the churning waters. Suddenly, a jolt. Not a wave, but a sickening crunch that reverberated through the hull, throwing both men off balance. The ferry lurched violently to the left, sending a spray of icy river water over them. Jim cursed, wrestling the rudder with all his might, his face a mask of grim determination. "Submerged log," he bellowed, his voice raw. "Damn river's full of 'em." Silas, sprawled beside the coffin, fought to regain his footing. The impact had shaken something loose within him, a fragile hope he hadn't realized he possessed. He pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the churning water, then settling on the wooden box beside him. It was then he heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible against the storm's fury. A sound like a half-strangled kitten, a tiny, reedy whimper that seemed to defy the chaos surrounding them. Silas blinked, straining his ears, convinced the wind was playing tricks on him. Then it came again, clearer this time, a soft, mewling cry. It emanated from inside the coffin. Dusty Jim, still wrestling with the rudder, froze. His weathered hands, usually so steady, trembled. He hadn't heard it clearly, but the sudden rigidity in Silas's posture, the way the younger man's eyes were wide with the terror that transcended the storm, told him something was profoundly wrong. Jim glanced at Silas, then slowly, reluctantly, let his gaze drift to the coffin. Another cry, this one a little stronger, undeniable, a baby's cry. Jim's breath hitched. Disbelief warred with a cold, creeping dread. His mind, usually so pragmatic, raced, trying to reconcile the impossible. a coffin, a baby. The two concepts collided in a grotesque, horrifying symphony. His gruff exterior crumbled, revealing a raw, startled vulnerability. He stared at the lacquered wood, then back at Silas, a silent question hanging heavy between them, louder than the thunder. The implication, unspoken but understood, sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the biting wind. The river, the storm, the danger of drowning, all faded, replaced by the chilling mystery within the box. A secret revealed. The rusted hinges groaned, a protest that echoed eerily in the cavernous interior of Jim's ferry house. His hands, usually steady from years of rowing against treacherous currents, trembled as he worked the pry bar. A fine sheen of sweat slicked his brow despite the chill dampness seeping in from the river. He hadn't believed Silas, not truly, not until the faint, almost imperceptible whimpers had filtered through the rough-hewn pine. Jim had seen enough death to know its silence, and this coffin was anything but silent. With a final, desperate heave, the lid splintered free, exposing a dark, cramped space. Jim peered inside, his breath catching in his throat. Nestled amongst layers of tattered blankets, a tiny bundle stirred. A small, pink face emerged, eyes squeezed shut, a miniature mouth opening and closing in a soft rhythmic wail. It was a baby, a living, breathing, impossibly small human being, tucked away like contraband. Silas, who had been hovering by the door, his face a mask of abject terror, stumbled forward. "Lily," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry kindling. He reached out a hesitant finger, touching the infant's impossibly soft cheek. The baby's cries, though still muted, seemed to gain a new urgency, a plaintive plea that tugged at something deep within Jim's hardened core. Jim stared at Silas, 100 unspoken questions screaming in his mind. The ferryman's initial fury, hot and righteous, had cooled into a chilling dread. "What in the blazes have you done, Silas?" he demanded, the words a low growl. "A baby? In a coffin? Are you mad?" Silas flinched, his shoulders hunching as if to ward off a blow. His eyes darted nervously to the grimy window, as though expecting to see a phantom posse materialize from the mist. I had no choice, Jim. They'd have found her. He'd have found her." He wrung his hands. A habit Jim had noticed grew more pronounced with every mile they'd put behind them. "Jed Hawkins, the rattler, he killed her mama and papa. They were good folk, Jim. Tried to make a new life out west, far from the reach of the gang." Jim's jaw tightened. Jed, the rattler Hawkins, was a name whispered with fear from the dusty plains to the Rocky Mountains. A bandit with a reputation for merciless cruelty, known for leaving no witnesses. Lily's pa, he was a prospector. Silas continued, his voice barely audible. Stumbled onto a vein, a rich one. Hawkins heard tell of it. He and his men, they came for the gold. They killed them both, Jim. Right there in their cabin. I was scouting for them, for Hawkins. I saw it. The baby, she was hidden in the root cellar. I couldn't leave her. His voice cracked again, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. I had to save her, Jim. She's all that's left. The air in the ferry house grew heavy, thick with the weight of Silas's confession and the baby's fragile cries. Jim looked from the terrified man to the tiny, vulnerable life in the coffin. The wind howled outside, a mournful dirge, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Jim knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his simple life on the river had just been irrevocably swept away. A change of heart. The tiny, muffled wail cut through the roaring water, and Jim's hardened cynicism like a surgeon's scalpel. He'd seen plenty of grief, plenty of desperation, but never in a wooden box meant for the grave. His hands, calloused from years of gripping oars and hawsers, fumbled with the lid. Silas, his face a mask of frantic fear, tugged at his arm, muttering incoherent pleas. "Stand back, boy," Jim growled, though the usual venom was absent from his voice. The lid creaked open, revealing not the still, peaceful face of the departed, but a bundled swath of blankets. And nestled within, a pair of wide, startled blue eyes stared up at him. Baby Lily. A shock, cold and then strangely warm, coursed through Jim. He'd expected anything but this. A hidden stash of gold, a desperate fugitive, even a morbid prank. But a baby? A tiny, helpless creature in a coffin, adrift on a furious river. The irony, the sheer audacity of it, was almost too much to bear. Lily let out another cry, a surprisingly strong sound that seemed to demand attention. Jim, who hadn't held a child since his own childhood, felt a tremor run through him. He reached out, his fingers surprisingly gentle as they brushed the baby's soft cheek. The little hand, no bigger than his thumb, instinctively grasped his finger. In that instant, the river, the storm, Silas's desperate pleas, all faded into the background. A fierce, unbidden protectiveness surged within him. This child, abandoned and vulnerable, had somehow found her way to his care. He looked at the fragile bundle, then at the churning water. There was no turning back. He wouldn't abandon her. He couldn't. A silent vow, as strong and unyielding as the ironwood of his ferry, solidified in his heart. He would see this child safe. Silas, sensing the shift in the old man, stopped his frantic movements. He watched, wide-eyed, as Jim carefully lifted the baby from the coffin, cradling her awkwardly but securely. The child's cries softened, replaced by soft whimpers as she burrowed into his chest, her tiny fists clutching the front of his oilskin coat. "Hold on tight, little one," Jim murmured, his voice gruff but laced with a tenderness that would have astonished anyone who knew him. He secured the baby inside his coat, tucking her deep enough to shield her from the wind and spray, but not so deep as to smother her. Then, with a newfound ferocity, Jim turned back to the raging river. The current, which had seemed an insurmountable foe moments before, now felt like a challenge he was ready to meet head-on. He grabbed the oars, his knuckles white against the splintered wood. Each stroke was a declaration, a defiance against the forces of nature. The ferry shuddered and groaned, but Jim pulled, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He angled the bow into the swells, his eyes fixed on the distant, blurry outline of the far bank. The river clawed at them, trying to drag them downstream, to capsize their fragile vessel. Waves crashed over the bow, soaking him to the bone. But Jim didn't flinch. He bent over the oars, his body a living shield protecting the precious cargo beneath his coat. Every ounce of his strength, every flicker of his will, was now dedicated to one singular purpose: to deliver baby Lily to safety. The other side. The ferry shuddered, a grating screech of ancient wood against something solid. Silas, his muscles screaming from the relentless fight against the current, nearly collapsed. He'd braced for another wave, but this was different. The rocking stilled, replaced by a dull thud, then another. Through the driving rain he saw it, a muddy bank, barely visible in the gloom, appearing like a promise of salvation. Dusty Jim, a silhouette against the churning gray, let out a guttural grunt. He didn't look at Silas, his eyes fixed on the murky shore. "We're here, boy," he rasped, his voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. His grip on the steering oar finally slackened, his knuckles white and trembling. The roar of the river, which had been a deafening constant, began to recede. The wind, though still biting, lost its frantic edge. Above them, a thin, sickly sliver of pale light struggled to pierce the bruised clouds. The rain lessened, first to a deluge, then a heavy downpour, and finally a persistent drizzle that seemed almost gentle after the tempest. Lily's whimpers, which had been lost in the storm's fury, now became clear, a tiny, insistent cry that tugged at Silas's raw nerves. He leaned against the coffin, his chest heaving, the chill of the wet wood seeping into his weary bones. "Stay put," Jim barked, already scrambling towards the bow. He moved with a surprising agility for a man of his years, his heavy boots squelching in the accumulated rainwater. He fumbled with the thick mooring rope, his fingers stiff and clumsy. Silas watched him, a knot of apprehension tightening in his gut. They were across, but the ordeal wasn't truly over until they were securely ashore. A low groan escaped Jim's lips as he heaved the heavy rope, securing it to a gnarled, half-submerged tree root. The ferry shifted, settling with a final weary sigh against the muddy bank. The current still tugged at it, a reminder of the river's lingering power, but it held. Jim leaned against the makeshift anchor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wiped a hand across his face, smearing mud and rainwater across his stubbled jaw. For a fleeting moment, Silas saw something akin to relief in the ferryman's usually impassive eyes, quickly replaced by his customary grim set. "Right," Jim grunted, pushing himself upright. He cast a wary glance at Silas, then at the swaddled bundle on the coffin. "Now what are you going to do with that package?" His tone was laced with his usual cynicism, but the underlying tremor in his voice didn't escape Silas. It was the sound of a man who had faced down death and lived to tell the tale, even if he wouldn't admit it. Silas looked down at Lily, her tiny face flushed, her small fist batting at the air. The relief that flooded him was so profound, it almost buckled his knees. He was exhausted, soaked, and facing an uncertain future, but they had made it. They were on the other side. A silent farewell. The river mist, a cold, ethereal presence, coiled around them, an unseen hand plucking at their garments. Silas, his face a canvas of desperate gratitude, clutched Jim's arm. His fingers felt icy, a tremor running through them. "Jim," he croaked, his voice thick with unspent emotion. I'm at a loss for words. You saved her. You saved us." His eyes, like deep pools in the encroaching gloom, searched Jim's face, a silent testament to the impossible debt he carried. Jim's grunt was non-committal, offering neither solace nor refusal. He sensed the weight of Silas's gaze, the unspoken plea for understanding. Truth be told, he hadn't acted for Silas's sake. He'd acted because a baby was crying. Nothing more. Yet Silas perceived a deeper truth, a glimmer of reluctant kindness in Jim's flinty eyes that belied his rough exterior. He squeezed Jim's arm once more, a fervent, wordless thank you. Then, with a profound sigh that seemed to shed the burden of his entire troubled past, Silas turned. He dissolved into the deepening shadows, a phantom among phantoms, his form swiftly swallowed by the whispering willows along the riverbank. Jim watched him vanish, a strange hollowness unfurling in his chest. No dramatic farewell, no tear-streaked goodbyes. Just a silent disappearance, leaving behind only the lingering scent of damp earth and raw desperation. The ensuing silence was immense, broken solely by the gentle gurgle of the river and a tiny soft whimper from the bundle in Jim's arms, baby Lily. Her minuscule fist, no larger than a dried apricot, uncurled briefly before balling up again against his rough shirt. Her face, still ruddy and creased from her ordeal, was a portrait of vulnerable innocence. Her eyes, an astonishing blue even in the dimness, fluttered open, fixing on him with an unwavering stare. Jim gazed down at her, truly seeing her, and the full weight of the situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. Silas was gone, truly, irrevocably gone, and in his arms, a small, breathing human being, utterly dependent on him. This was no temporary arrangement. This wasn't merely ferrying a coffin across a churning river. This was permanent. He adjusted his hold, seeking a more comfortable way to cradle her. Her head wobbled precariously, and he instinctively tightened his arm, a protective urge he hadn't known he possessed, igniting within him. He was a ferryman, a creature of solitude, of ingrained habits, of predictable tides and unchanging banks. He understood how to mend a broken oar, how to interpret the river's currents, how to tie a knot that would not yield. He knew nothing of swaddling clothes or feeding schedules or lullabies. Lily let out another soft cry, a sound like a tiny, fragile bell. It wasn't a wail of distress, more a gentle, querulous complaint. Jim felt a strange tightening in his gut, a peculiar blend of panic and something else, something warm and unfamiliar. He was alone, truly alone, for the first time in years, yet paradoxically, he was no longer solitary. His world, once so neatly demarcated, had just expanded to encompass an entire universe of tiny needs and silent demands. The river flowed on, oblivious. The night closed in, and Dusty Jim, the gruff ferryman, stood on the bank, a baby in his arms, the reluctant guardian of a new, uncertain dawn. A new beginning. The morning sun, usually a harsh glare that Jim squinted against, felt different today. It streamed through the gaps in the cabin's makeshift door, painting a warm, dusty tableau on the floorboards. In the center of that light, cradled in his surprisingly steady arms, was Lily. She cooed, a soft, gurgling sound that resonated not in the room but deep within Jim's chest. The corners of his mouth, long accustomed to a downward tilt, curved upwards, a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't the cynical smirk he sometimes offered, nor the strained grimace of effort. This was something new, untainted, born of the tiny creature nestled against him. He gently shifted her, marveling at the improbable weight, the miniature fists that occasionally flailed, her eyes, wide and blue like the prairie sky, fixed on him with an unwavering trust that pricked at his hardened exterior. He'd lived alone for so long, the river his only constant companion, the solitude, a well-worn coat he never thought to shed. His days had been a predictable rhythm of repairs, ferry crossings, and the quiet hiss of the lantern at night. The occasional traveler was a fleeting shadow, a brief interruption before the familiar silence returned. Now, that silence was shattered, replaced by the soft gurgle of an infant, the rustle of a blanket, the unexpected warmth of a small body against his own. He remembered the coffin, the chilling discovery, the frantic, desperate moments on the rising river. He'd risked his life, not for gold or glory, but for a faint cry that pierced through the storm. And here she was, the reason, the unlooked-for consequence. He'd been a ferryman, a lone wolf on the fringes of civilization, content in his self-imposed exile. Now, he was a guardian. The word felt foreign on his tongue, weighty and profound. Lily's tiny hand reached out, her fingers wrapping around his gnarled, calloused thumb with surprising strength. A jolt, not unpleasant, went through him. He'd never imagined this, never wanted it. Yet, looking at her innocent face, a quiet certainty settled in his bones. This was his path now, whether he liked it or not. And strangely, he found he didn't mind. He walked to the cabin door, careful not to jostle her, and looked out at the familiar expanse of the frontier. The river, his lifeblood, flowed lazily under the morning sun, its surface glinting like scattered diamonds. Beyond it, the vast, untamed land stretched to the horizon, promising both danger and opportunity. He'd always seen it as a place to outrun, to escape, to be left alone. Now, with Lily stirring gently in his arms, it looked like a beginning. He imagined the journey ahead, the watchful nights, the gentle guidance he would have to offer. He wasn't a father, not by any stretch, but he was all she had, and she, in turn, was chipping away at the rigid confines of his solitary world, making room for something tender, something hopeful. He still had his rifle, his wits, and his old, trusty boat. But now he also had a purpose that went beyond merely existing. He would learn, he would adapt, he would protect. The gruff, cynical Jim was slowly, irrevocably fading away, replaced by something softer, stronger, more human. The frontier, vast and unforgiving, waited, and Jim, with Lily snuggled against him, was finally ready to face it, not alone, but with a new, unexpected companion.